Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Gramophone podcast. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and this week we've got another of our special editions devoted to exploring in depth the music of a specific composer. This time it's the turn of Shostakovich, and to explore his music with a particular focus on his symphonies, many excerpts from which you can hear in the hour of discussion ahead, I'm joined by Edward Seckerson. This podcast is brought to you in association with Stage Plus, the new streaming service from Deutsche Grammophon, which offers weekly live stream videos of concerts from around the world, as well as an archive of over 400 concerts to enjoy on demand, plus documentaries, audio albums, interviews and much more. Visit stage-plus.com or download the Stage Plus iOS app. Now, over to our exploration of the music of Shostakovich. I'm once again joined by Edward Seckerson, who spoke so fascinatingly and thought-provokingly about Mahler in an earlier edition. But this time, our subject is Shostakovich. Edward, welcome. Shostakovich's life was a quite extraordinary one by any standards, as the lives of many public figures in the Soviet regime were. But even before, we consider that he was one of the leading creative voices of the 20th century. So let's just begin by just sketching out his life, who he was, where he came from, and what form his life did take, and what implications that might have for the music we're going to go on to talk about.
Well, I always think composers are born, not made. And he was one of 3 children, born in St. Petersburg, post-revolution. And clearly, from a very young age, was prodigiously gifted. His mother played piano, and she taught him from the age of 8, I think it was. But by 9, he was attempting to write an opera on a Pushkin story. So that gives you an idea of how fast he was moving. It was a difficult family life because this was a very upper middle class family, and the father died quite suddenly in 1922. And so the mother was having to work very long hours to keep the family afloat. And also there was a sense that in post-revolution Russia that, the upper middle classes were expected to conform in some way, and it was not the image that the post-revolution state wanted. And so they struggled. And Shostakovich himself, as a boy, was playing to earn extra money for silent movies in the local cinema, which is really important, actually, because, there are stories of him getting told off for laughing too much at Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. And here was this undernourished, tubercular boy whose family was struggling and laughing at these silent movies and providing underscoring for them. And there's a juxtaposition there of the sad and tragic and the funny, which is really important in his music.
And really important in those films that you've mentioned.
Well, yes, actually, pathos and comedy go hand in hand in so many cases. But so, this is how he made a living. At 13, though, he was at the conservatory in Leningrad. Alexander Glazunov was in charge at the time. And he graduated aged 18 with a first symphony, which was his graduation piece, and which is, by anybody's standards, phenomenally exciting. I mean, all the elements that make up his musical personality are there, from the wit and sarcasm and tragedy, and all painted in very broad brushstrokes from a young man. Great sense of irony. And in the last movement of that piece, I always think he uses a solo piano to rippling effect, and I always see these flickering images of silent movies. I'm sure this is where that sound came from, and also that desire to underscore huge events. I mean, he was people who want to criticize Shostakovich often say, he's a great film composer. His music is still used on documentaries all over the place as background music, but that's because he had this ability to create atmosphere and tell stories in music as well. So that's the background, essentially.
And that's also a great place to begin our musical excerpts in this podcast. So let's hear an excerpt from Shostakovich's First Symphony. And as you've alluded to there, when exploring Shostakovich, there are a number of key extra musical events and situations which are fundamental to defining his work. And one, of course, is the Soviet regime and the repressive control exerted by Stalin and the authorities. Shostakovich would have had to have walked a tightrope throughout his whole creative life. And can you give us some examples of how this affected his work directly from this early stage onwards, really?
Yes, well, I mean, he was headed for a lifetime of ambiguity and double speak. There was always this pull between the music he really wanted to write and the music he felt he should write or was being told to write. And I think he very quickly realised at a very young age, and his first 3 symphonies were written before the age of 23. And when we look at the second and third symphonies, well, we only have to look at their titles. The second symphony, 2 October, which was a 10-year celebration of the revolution, and the third symphony, the 1st of May, which again has a propaganda angle. And there he was experimenting on the one hand. If you listen to these pieces, they're not terribly good, either of them, but there are interesting aspects. There he was experimenting on the one hand and then setting these awful texts that he actually said were awful later in life. You know, so he knew exactly what he was doing, and he had to find a way of somehow coding his messages, coding the music he wanted to write in such a way that it wouldn't fall foul of the regime, because it was becoming increasingly apparent that they simply wanted to have complete control, not over society, but the arts as well, and certainly music, because music is a great underscoring for propaganda events. So those 2 symphonies, I don't think anyone takes really seriously. But when we get to the 4th symphony, this is where things become really interesting, because in this piece, we see this extraordinary talent really experimenting, really finding his own voice as well, in a very different way to the way it might develop later on. But it's an extraordinary piece, and of course it had to be withdrawn. And this was the point at which he realised that that somehow or other he was going to have to find a way of in a sense cheating the authorities or working past the authorities. Of course, there's the famous story of Stalin walking out of his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, which is all happening around the same time. I happen to think that's a real masterpiece. I mean, to think he wrote it in his late 20s is quite extraordinary. But it's a piece about a victim. It's a piece about repressive society. It's a piece about provincialism. These were all the things he kind of despised growing up as a young man. So the 4th symphony is interesting, but it also contains in its second movement, at the end of its second movement, an extraordinary motif which is going to become really significant throughout his life. And it's a ticking motif in the percussion section. He was an extraordinary imaginative use of percussion throughout his life. And nowhere more so than this moment. And it's almost like time passing in an extraordinary way. It's slightly space age, it's slightly surreal. And this motif, when the symphony was withdrawn, and it didn't reappear till much later, and people in the West, I mean Ormandy for example, performed it and recorded it in the West at a later date, people began to realise what an amazing piece it was. And the question began to ask, where was he going to go next? But this motif appears in at least 2 other major pieces, and ends his final symphony, the 15th symphony. And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but I think it's important to recognize that it was always with him, this idea, this motif, in a symbolic way. Many years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Rostropovich on one or two occasions, who had the composer's ear, and we were in his flat in Paris, and that's a podcast in itself. I mean, it was hilarious, and the place was packed with Russian artifacts. I think he and Galina Vishnevskaya had raided the Winter Palace before they left Russia, but it was extraordinary. But he was talking about that last symphony because he had not long recorded it, and I said, what do you make of that ending? And there's also this sustained high string line, and he said, I see it as this silken ladder to eternity. That's very Rostropovich, very theatrical. And I said, but also, do you think it was his last laugh? That he had managed to fool the authorities for so long and be himself and become hugely famous internationally in such a way that the authorities could no longer touch him, really. And Rostropovich smiled, and an enigmatic smile, but it was a smile of agreement. He knew what was going on.
No, that's absolutely fascinating. Just get back to the fourth. Can you capture why it was withdrawn?
I think it was withdrawn by the composer because he knew what was going to happen. I mean, it was what happened with Lady Macbeth was a clear indication that the direction he wanted to go in was not going to be acceptable. And although the fourth, in many ways, it's quite a rambling piece in some ways, but it is kind of vaguely in a kind of sonata form. And I always think that the march at the beginning of the fourth reminds me in a strange way of Mahler 3, with that horn call and march, summer marches in idea. And he was, of course, very aware of Mahler, no question about that. And I think it was an ambitious hour-long symphony, which, I mean, another conversation I had about the last movement of that piece, there's the final climax in the piece, is a really dissonant kind of triumphalism. And I always saw this tattered flag. And I once shared a car with Ashkenazi talking about Shostakovich. The only time we could do the interview was on the way to the airport. And he loved that image of the tattered flag. But it's obvious when you hear the music that this is a false kind of triumphalism. And it would take a different form in the Fifth Symphony, which went a completely different direction. And of course was supposedly prefaced by that line, a Soviet artist's reply to just criticism, which generations of people have taken with a pinch of salt. Was he being sarcastic? I'm going to be a good boy from now on. And yet he wrote a piece whose homage to Tchaikovsky is never clearer. I mean, this was, Shostakovich in full Tchaikovskyan mode, if you like, and it's a very beautiful and successful piece. But it confused people for a long time, and the people who championed it, like Leonard Bernstein and Andrei Previn, always took this upbeat view of the ending of the piece. And it became apparent, if you really looked at the metronome mark, that it was supposed to be taken much, much slower. And if you take it much slower, it becomes a different message altogether. This compulsion to celebrate. You will be triumphant. You will celebrate. And you feel like you're being beaten over the head with all these repeated notes, which sound really hollow.
You're absolutely right. I mean, so doing recordings of it, you listen to the end when performed like that, and it does feel unsettling. It doesn't feel triumphant. It almost feels slightly sort of brutal in terms of what you're hearing in that brass.
Yeah, it really does, and it's amazing that a tempo change can have that effect.
Yeah. Does it inject more space into it, maybe?
I think it just makes it sound more emptier.
Yes.
Yeah. Because while it's upbeat and while it's moving, you don't hear all those repeated notes in the same way. And people like Bernstein made it was one of his calling cards. But had he lived a bit longer to read more about, after Testimony came out, Volkov's book, but even, the secret Shostakovich were kept all his life. I met his son Maxime, and even Maxime knew, I felt, kind of less than Rostropovich did, perhaps because he wasn't privy to that kind of information, but I'm sure that he and Rostropovich had some heart-to-hearts. I don't know, maybe it was just that Rostropovich was more cynical himself about the course of the regimes in the Soviet Union. But one thing was clear, that we're talking about a composer who was one when the failed revolution happened, and never quite got to write his celebratory Lenin symphony in the way that was expected, and we'll talk about that in a bit in a while. So I think when you hear the end of the Fifth Symphony and how different it can sound, you realize how cleverly disguised his protests were, if you like. And he honed this skill all his life, this ability to go just as far as he might without losing favor with the authorities, and actually to go further, but in a very subtext kind of way. And he was a very bad liar. You knew always when Shostakovich was writing music he didn't want to write, the Second and the Third Symphonies. And later on, ironically, the so-called Lenin Symphony, the 12th Symphony, which he finally got round to celebrating Lenin in, and it just doesn't ring true. It sounds more like movie music than almost anything else he wrote. It's very exciting and it's very satisfying to hear a performance of, but it isn't profound in the way that the 11th Symphony about the failed revolution is. Because he knew that when we get to the war, and he knew that the dangers of Nazism and the siege of Leningrad, all that stuff, he always had at the back of his mind that form of repression was going to be replaced by another form of repression in the figure of Stalin and the regime that he created.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that point about the 12th, because it is a fascinating thing. It is an exciting piece of music. It's very well crafted, and yet it doesn't ring true in your listening of it. Is that because of what we know about him in the wider context, or is there something intrinsic within that piece of work that just doesn't feel like there's the integrity that perhaps it supposes?
I think once you know the canon of symphonies, you can hear its misgivings very clearly. It also has a not dissimilar ending from the fifth. In that it's hammering away at this triumphalism in a way that isn't convincing. It just isn't convincing, and you kind of want to cheer at the end because it's exciting, but it leaves you with that empty feeling. And you've only got to see the way Shostakovich over his career set words I mean, this is where he had this thing with Britten as well. Benjamin Britten saw that in him, and indeed he dedicated the 14th Symphony to Britten. They were both great word setters, so there was a kinship there, but you only had to see the way he set words and the words he chose to set. A lot of Jewish texts, the Yevtushenko text for Babi Yar, the 13th Symphony, which was a huge attack on Russia being complicit in a terrible kind of anti-Semitism during the war years. And, you could tell when he was engaged and when he was moved, and because the subtext becomes profound and you feel it as well as hear it. The thing about Shostakovich is there is so little on the page. You look at some of these scores and you think, how on earth does he achieve these extraordinary atmospheres and this extraordinary visceral quality, this directness in his music, which is why it's so popular. Audiences who've never heard classical music before will hear a Shostakovich symphony and they'll leave feeling stirred and excited, and because it is so direct. So you can tell when there's so little on the page, there might be an empty texture with just a cor anglais solo. That was his instrument of choice for desolation and regret. And indeed, in my favourite of his symphonies, the 11th Symphony, and it's a symphony that was gone in and out of favour over the years, and in the beginning was tending to be dismissed as superior film music because it is very pictorial. This is about the year 1905 and the massive massacre in the Winter Palace. And what I think is so moving about it, and in the last movement there is this long cor anglais solo, and all the themes in that symphony are revolutionary songs. So again, he's paying tribute to the people who brought the revolution about, even though it failed on that occasion. But he's also sounding a warning note. He's also, he knows what they're fighting against on a broader scale, because by then he was old enough to know what happened in Russia after, the war. And that solo, when you hear it, you think, gosh, and it goes right up to the high register of the cor anglais, becomes really pained and anguished, and you think, why didn't he write that for oboe? And the answer is because he wanted the instrument to be stretched. He wanted it to express that extreme anguish in the sound. And it's that simple. It's that simple, that when you hear those solos, and they're all over his symphonies, these long wind solos over very little else, you realize that those are the plaints, if you like, of his innermost feelings.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Let's hear some of that cor anglais solo from the finale of the 11th Symphony. And it's interesting that you mention the revolutionary songs as being part of the thematic fabric of the piece.
I mean, that was a conscious choice, and I think it's what makes the piece so deeply affecting as well as graphic. One of the most used passages in symphonic music, but documentary film as well, is the massacre sequence in the second movement, and it is the extraordinary passage for solo percussion, which is like a huge military tattoo, And the effect of that, I mean, he could do this over and over again, you know, that he would suddenly, the orchestra would clear out and the percussion would be solo, because it's our most basic instinct is rhythm, and the sound of this momentum, this kind of juggernaut moving along. These were all the images one has when he scores like that, and this all it is this tattoo of percussion. It's so violent, it could not be more graphic. And then at the climax of it, he brings back this tune, this revolutionary tune that he's referred to elsewhere, bare their heads. It's another, you know, pride thing, and it roars out in the orchestra at the time. These were kind of big rhetorical gestures that he mastered like no one else. Many people have tried to imitate Shostakovich, and there were people before around him like Weinberg, who was hugely influenced by him, but none of them, however successful they were as composers, none of them had this extraordinary directness, that he just somehow knew how to make those moments work and communicate with people. And the 11th is full of what you might think of as underscoring at times, like the Palace Square at the beginning, just long chords and cold and icy, and premonitions of something going horribly wrong in due course. It's so simple, but you're immediately sucked into this world. And I think this was undoubtedly the music he wanted to write, both to pay tribute to the people who fought for this freedom, but also to remind people of what was lost and what is still being lost at the time of writing in that piece.
Absolutely. And actually, Shostakovich was perhaps the master of creating a sense of premonition with musical language. It's extraordinary how he does it, but it's there in so much. Let's take a bit of a step back and explore further this idea of double speak and irony. But before we do that, it's perhaps just worth asking why he did stay in Russia. When other figures you've mentioned, Rostropovich, Ashkenazi, they did defect to the West. Shostakovich stayed, and obviously his relationship with the regime was complex and was very difficult. But and he did protest, but yet there he stayed. Why was that?
I mean, that's the question that everybody asks and nobody can answer. And it's the question that I wanted to get from his son. And either he was just being tactful and evasive, or and didn't want to go there. But I think probably love of his homeland. I mean, you look at figures like Rachmaninoff, who was never happy, but you know, had to live in exile for so much of his life, and so I think that profound love, but also because I think he felt the challenge of remaining in his home country, not being driven out, and still writing the music he wanted to write. And as you get to the later symphonies, you know, there's less and less interference. There's still him playing games with the regime, but you know, you hear something like the 14th Symphony, which is basically a song cycle for two voices and strings and percussion, and there's a lot of death in that piece and a lot of imprisonment and suppression, all those themes that he tackled all his life. But there's also tremendous humour and irony, black irony, which of course he got from all those Jewish texts but also from he loved that kind of humour. Clearly he shared that with Mahler, certainly, that ability to be blackly ironic in the pieces, and it's a good weapon. It's a weapon of mass destruction if you use it well.
Yeah. Is it just that as he got older and as he was ever more established, he could get away with it? Or perhaps was there just a different attitude towards music by the later stages of the regime?
I think he became so famous. He was, one of the great national treasures for the country, and he was a great ambassador when he went abroad. When I was a boy, I saw him in the box at the Festival Hall at the London premiere, the UK premiere, the first violin concerto with Oistra. And there he was with the thick glasses and this rather shadowy figure in the box. I'll never forget that. Just like the photographs, this serious, shadowy figure. But I think it probably was as simple that he was Russian through and through, and that he didn't want to be defeated by a regime which he knew would pass. Whether it would be supplanted by an even worse regime, that's the story of that country. But I think it was, and you hear in his music, it is profoundly Russian.
Yeah.
There's no getting away from that.
Yeah. So he stayed, but through his music, not remotely supportive or complicit, always himself as far as he could be. And yet, symphonies like the 13th, the authorities did step in and ask for a change.
They tried. I mean, that was really to do with Yevtushenko, and they didn't provide texts at the premiere, which is ludicrous, as if not providing text would silence the words. But that's the kind of, imbecilic stuff that used to go on around him. But he was very resilient to it, and indeed I think he rather enjoyed playing these games, these tricks on people who were his intellectual inferiors. And in a sense, my favourite trick was that, whether by design or not, word got around after the Fifth Symphony that the Sixth would be his big Lenin celebration. And indeed the Sixth arrived, and the first movement is this extraordinary largo of profound seriousness. And you think, gosh, this is going to turn into a real epic. It's a big movement. And what does he do? He follows it with two circus acts, two movements which are complete, outrageous kind of tomfoolery. And exciting as well, but just completely wrong foots, pulls the rug from beneath the establishment's feet, and nobody knew what to make of it. And I'm sure there were grumblings in corners about this man is still a rebel, and this man is not conforming, and he won't ever conform. And so it went on along those lines. You couldn't second guess him at all. And I'm sure that was conscious, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe in the moment he wrote the first movement of the Sixth, and then he thought, do you know what? I want to write two jolly movements. I want to write a 3-movement symphony. I don't know. And it's the fact that he kept everybody guessing, including his own son, that makes me feel that these were secrets that will never be plumbed.
No, and I guess not leaving any record of it was perhaps a form of protection at the time.
It's easy to read into all this stuff, of course, Martin, that in the way that Volkov did, that everything had a meaning and a purpose, or Vasily Petrenko. I did a long set of podcasts with him once about the Shostakovich symphonies, and he was very good on them, but he kept using the word script, and his script was this and his script was that. And of course by that I think he means that he wrote the script in music that would get him by, he would survive in that way. But I don't know that any of it was as conscious as people make out. I think he just wrote the music eventually that he wanted to write and needed to write. Coming back to this idea of him being a very bad liar, I've talked about the 11th Symphony, which moves me terribly when I hear it. And it ends with this ringing of bells, major, minor, dissonant collision, really, if you like, and it's supposed to be kind of triumphant. It's like Boris Godunov, the end of that piece. But this dissonance that comes out and is again a question mark, a big ambiguous question mark. But I feel that whole piece comes from his heart and soul, and indeed so did the Leningrad, which came out of terrible circumstances. And there are all the wonderful stories about the first performance being cobbled together with semi-amateur players, and the score being smuggled out on microfilm to America, where Toscanini was waiting to perform it, kind of thing. Incidentally, going back to the very beginning of the first symphony, the 18-year-old's first symphony was seized upon by Toscanini, Bruno Walter, conductors of this stature. So he had arrived at that time. And isn't it interesting that we don't really talk about the second and third symphonies anymore? Yeah. They're there and they have a meaning, but we don't really talk about them anymore because we know that they were the turning point, in a way, of him deciding that I must write what I need to write and not what I'm being told to write.
Yeah. And to return to your point about always reading something into the symphonies, and is that always the right thing to do? And we have been very focused on the symphonies, but actually, looking at his wider work, things like the piano concertos, for example, there's just moments of actually extraordinary beauty as well as drama, and the cello concertos. Are we there looking at music which we can read things into, or are we just looking at the music he wanted to write, and perhaps there's a lesson in that?
I think pure music in those pieces, partly because he was a pianist himself, and his son was a pianist, and those are the pieces you want to write. The second movement of the second concerto is almost Rachmaninovian.
Yes.
It is so old-fashioned. The first piano concerto with the solo trumpet is there's a bit of gamesmanship going on there, and again this parody and humour and sarcasm, which were things that you can read into, but maybe they were just there because he liked that kind of humour.
Yeah, but then there are moments in, say, the quartets where there was very specific, fearful moments of reality, as it were.
And of course, when you get to the quartets, you are pared down to 4 solo voices, and you suddenly realise that the same rules he applies he applies to a 120-piece orchestra. Yeah. And that is it's still very lucid, very direct, very clear, but the sound world is just shrunk. And all those preludes and fugues, solo piano, exploring a very old form in his way, and the gamesmanship of composition, which of course all composers to some extent engage in. We're talking a lot about subtext because his life was so extraordinary, and the subtext is always so important. And the temperament of the people who conduct these pieces is so important. I talked about that a lot with Mahler, and I hold true to that. You can be as honest as you like about, and as faithful as you like to what is on the page, but if you don't have the temperament to convey the subtext of these composers, then you're nowhere. It's so interesting that, for example, the piece I've mentioned, the 14th Symphony, the song settings, the Rostropovich recording of that piece with Vishnevskaya takes us on another level. I have never heard a performance of that piece to come anywhere near it, because the temperament of those two figures, I mean, Rostropovich called Vishnevskaya a peasant in a fur coat, which I thought was a wonderful way of, but I mean, here was this very powerful and emotive singer, the original soprano in Britain's War Requiem, and all this kind of going on, and this rebellious husband of hers who premiered so many pieces. It's wonderful. It was never going to be anything less than electrifying, and that is about those musicians, as opposed to someone sitting down and saying, well, we'll make a nice recording of this piece or that piece.
And hearing Rostropovich play Shostakovich's music is always fascinating, because there you do have someone who, as you said earlier, knew his mind and perhaps knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, I think the last symphony, when I had this conversation in Paris, the last symphony poses many riddles, if you like, because it begins with what seems to be sort of parlour games of childlike, and the introduction of the William Tell overture theme, and little bits of tune percussion and raucous trumpets, and it's playful, but in a kind of dark way. And the William Tell idea, I think it's because he was writing a rhythm, ba-da-dum, 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 which is a very common rhythm for Shostakovich, and he thought of the tune. So it was there on the page. I don't think there's any more profound subtext, but I think it's him playing games he knew would be disapproved of. By then it was too late, of course, this was a late work, but nobody knew what to make of that piece. All the Wagner quotes in it, and the beginning of Tristan with where it goes off into a resolved chord instead of that unresolved no man's land chord that's become so famous. All these little tricks were extraordinary, and ending of course with that percussion motif that he hung on to for all those years. Did he know it was his last symphony? Had he planned not to write any more, and he wanted it to end with that, the last laugh, as you say? Rostropovich was people like Rostropovich had all kinds of personal ideas about what the jokes were, but nobody can ever really know. But the last laugh is, I think, a good way of summing up his life.
Yeah, there, absolutely. It's all there in the music for us to wonder at, ponder at, but to enjoy. One symphony that we haven't mentioned, and yet is regarded by many as one of his finest achievements, is his 10th symphony.
Yes, indeed. And I think in many ways it can lay claim to being his most perfect piece. And I remember Bernstein talking about it. It was one of the symphonies that he conducted on a regular basis. And from a musical perspective, he thought it was, 20th century perfection, that was what the symphony was going to be, and very important. But I think it's important in other respects too, because it's the before and after Stalin symphony. This is the real turning point in the piece. And indeed, again, we don't know whether it's true or not, but that demonic scherzo, which is in the right hands is unhinged and very exciting, is supposedly a portrait of Stalin ripping through the fabric of Russian society. And then in the aftermath of Stalin, the last two movements, you have his musical motif, if you like, his monogram, DSCH, those four notes in the German notation. And this became his personal monogram, and therefore he imposes it with a will in the last two movements. It appears all the time, and indeed at the very end of the piece it's even a solo in the timpani, those four notes. That's Shostakovich finally asserting himself after being in the shadow of Stalin for so long. And so you've got a double whammy there. You've got a piece which is masterfully constructed in very conventional symphonic terms, really, and that's why I think people gravitate towards it. It doesn't go off at tangents. It's not illustrative, really, of anything. It is just musical. It's a piece of music, and but again, there's a subtext to it, because as I've just described it, quite consciously he changes direction halfway through the piece and asserts himself in an interesting way, defiantly, if you will. There's another word in reviewing Shostakovich I use all the time. I find there's a defiance about this music, which people relate to when they hear it performed live in the right hands. And the last thing you want to do with it is manicure it in any way. It should have some rough edges. And I suppose that brings us to this massive catalogue now.
No, absolutely. Let's finish by talking about who some of the great Shostakovich interpreters have been. We've mentioned some of them, but if you could direct our listeners towards particular recordings.
Well, there are cycles by people like Rudolf Barshai and Kirill Kondrashin, which are exciting and highly regarded, that are available now. We should look at people like Yevgeny Mravinsky, who made an extraordinary recording of the Eighth Symphony. There's probably more than one nowadays. You never know. There are live recordings, and the Eighth Symphony is one of the war symphonies that again finds great favour in high circles. And it's funny, isn't it, that I keep going back to the 11th Symphony, and I keep saying how moved I am and excited I am by the 11th Symphony. And I really truly believe that was as personal a piece as he wrote. And Pache, all those other voices that say, oh no, it's film music, it's. But so those main conductors, Ravinsky again had that temperament, that Russian temperament that took the music to the edge. You probably remember those huge percussion crescendos, again percussion, which are like seismic upheavals in the Eighth Symphony, and they happen all the way through the piece. And it's just simple. It's a drum roll, but it comes up through the floor, and it's terrifying. So you have to have, it cannot just be, an exciting moment. It has to be a frightening moment as well. So those people in more modern time, there's I've mentioned Leonard Bernstein. There's, indeed, I chose it in Building a Library on Radio 3. His recording of the Leningrad Symphony, the 7th Symphony with Chicago, is one of the great Shostakovich recordings. The stars were in alignment that day, and Lenny was totally engaged with it, and it is phenomenal. There's no question about it. And I still think the middle movements of that piece are like nothing else he ever wrote. So that is a very, very interesting piece, and Bernstein's Chicago recording is peerless, I think. Vasily Petrenko, we've mentioned, recorded the whole cycle with the Royal Liverpool Phil. Excellent recording of 4 and 10. The performance that knocked me sideways recently, and I reviewed it in Gramophone, was Gennady Rozhdestvensky's recording of the 4th, that we've talked so much about, this turning point piece, with the BBC Symphony sounding galvanised. I mean, extraordinary. I put it on thinking, oh, I'm not sure what I'm going to make of this, because Rozhdestvensky could be quite a lazy conductor in some ways. You know, he had it all, but he could just stand on his non-podium and you know, go through the motions. But this performance is something else. So I would direct people to that, the Fourth Symphony. Andris Nelson's Boston Symphony, his recording of the 10th is very exciting. I think it was a Gramophone Record of the Month. There's a pretty damn good 5th as well in there. They're not all great. Sometimes they sound a little bit, I use that word again, manicured, as though they're very well put together, but it wasn't happening that day. But, and I should mention, because I once chose his 10th in building a library, Nema Järvi and the Scottish National Orchestra. There are some, I mean, he's one of the very great conductors of our time, I think, who deeply underrated. When you look at that recorded output and the quality of it, it's mind-boggling. And his sons have inherited some of the genes, haven't they?
And a love of recording, which I think is very exciting.
Yeah, exactly. So that's those are the pieces. And of my beloved 11th Symphony, I mean, we had a terrific performance in the BBC Phil and Stuttgart, which had the advantage of fabulous Chandos engineering and proper bells at the end. You know, in fact, the Royal Liverpool Phil commissioned, I think, a bell for that purpose, which does the rounds of the orchestras whenever they're doing it. And I remember when he did it live at the Proms, Stuttgart, he had the bell in the gallery. Oh, yes. And I was looking at the orchestra and I thought, where's the bell? You know, this is the big moment at the end. And it clanged out from up above in the most extraordinary effect. But there's also recently, again, I reviewed it for Gramophone, a very unexpected version of the 11th, which I thought was really outstanding, from Eliyahu Inbal with the Stuttgart Orchestra. And it's interesting because he is a great Mahlerian. And, you know, his cycle had many advocates over the years with the Israel Phil. And, you know, it probably doesn't pass muster always now, but at the time it was important, and I think he really understood that music. I think he really understands Shostakovich, and this performance with this young orchestra is really exciting. Unfortunately, you don't get the Chandos bells at the end, but you can't have everything, can you?
Well, Edward Seckerson, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your personal insights and personal passion for Shostakovich's music with us. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
My thanks to Edward Seckerson for joining us to talk about the music of Shostakovich. And for full details of all the excerpts you've heard throughout the podcast, visit gramophone.co.uk/podcast. This podcast is brought to you in association with Stage Plus, the new streaming service from Deutsche Grammophon, which offers weekly live stream videos of concerts from around the world, as well as an archive of over 400 concerts to enjoy on demand, plus documentaries, audio albums, interviews, and much more. Visit stage-plus.com or download the Stage Plus iOS app. I hope you've enjoyed this Gramophone podcast. If you have, we'd be hugely grateful if you could leave a rating or a review, hit the subscribe button, or simply tell your friends about our work. And if you want to explore classical music in even greater depth with Gramophone, then we produce a monthly magazine packed full of interviews, features and reviews, and all listeners to this podcast can get a 20% discount by visiting gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and entering podcast 20 at the checkout. Thank you for listening, and do join us again for another Gramophone podcast next week.